Every plane at some point needs some tuning. Very important to get it performed the best is to tune it up. This is a flea market tool, probably needs a complete going over. What do I need to do? I need to check that the sole is flat, so it's really acting as a long plane, not just a small part of it flat. I need to check the mouth opening, that it's nice and sharp, and that it's well flattened in that area. I'll need to check that the cap iron fits the iron, the handles are tight, and that the bed of the plane where the iron rests is a nice flat slope and supporting it well. And adjusting the frog so you have a nice, consistent, fine opening in the mouth. To flatten the sole, I'm going to use this nice old cast iron flattening plate with a piece of sandpaper on it. You could just as easily use a piece of float glass, plate glass, or sandpaper on your jointer or table saw table. I keep the plane set up the way it would be in normal use, the plane iron backed up slightly, and I'm going to use nice even pressure, turning the plane around every so often, but pressure towards the middle of the plane rather than at the ends. What I'm shooting for is to flatten the toe, in front of the mouth, and the heel. This area is less important, but those three areas are very important. Turn the plane around every so often. And you'll know you're on the right track when you start to see those areas brighten up. This has got a ways to go yet, especially around the throat. You'll know you're done when you hold a good straight edge to it and you see no light at those three important points, at the toe, just in front of the mouth, and at the heel. The next area I'm going to address is the mouth opening. I talked earlier about how important the mouth opening is to break the shavings. I want it to be nice and sharp. And I want it to be slightly angled forward. I'm going to file it with a mill file. Slightly angled forward here so there's more clearance for the shavings. I want it to be straight, and I want it to have a nice sharp corner there. Don't worry about opening the throat opening too much, because you can adjust that with a frog later on. While you have the file out, relieve all the edges all the way around the plane sole so there's nothing sharp, no burrs. I like to make sure the handles are tight. There's something that shrink over time, and they can often get loose. But to get a good hold of the plane, I want them nice and snug. The front knob is the one that is the easiest probably. That's just a nice big screw that comes through. But if you find that you can't tighten it up, you might have to shorten this up a small amount because it goes down into a boss here and there's only so far you can screw it in. That's a pretty easy one. The next tuning step is to check the frog. Make sure that the bed of the iron is nice and flat in one plane. You can imagine how important that is to have the plane iron very well supported, well bedded in that part of the plane. It's going to have a lot of pressure against it. If it's not sitting flat, it'll vibrate and shatter. Generally, these are well made, even historically, so probably there's a burr or two maybe is the most it has in terms of problems. I would just check it with a straight edge. Make sure that it looks like it's not warped or somehow bent. Why do they call this a frog? That's an interesting name for a piece of metal. Well, one idea is it's a frog in your throat or the mouth of the plane. The other idea is when you take that piece out, it actually looks like the frog of a horse's hoof. Let's take the frog out to make sure there's no sawdust or accumulated gunk under it. That'll definitely affect the bedding of the iron as well if the frog is not well attached to the sole. I like to make sure that this is nice and clean. And this is nice and clean as well. Now be careful when you put these back in, because you can over-tighten these. It's going into soft cast iron. If you over-tighten them, you can strip them to some degree, and then your frog will not be very securely attached to the sole. And while we have this out, I'll adjust the frog for position. So I'm going to leave these slightly loose. And the way to adjust it for position is put the blade back in, clamp down, and see what kind of throat opening you have. Well, it's quite open. So I can come back in here and start to close it up a little bit. There's a screw in the back that'll move the frog forward. And what I'm shooting for is a nice, fine mouth opening, somewhere in the vicinity of maybe for this plane, a little less than a 1/16 of an inch. It's a general purpose tool. That looks pretty good right there. One more point about frogs. There's many different varieties, but two general ones that you can run into. One that has various points of attachment, sort of like this standard Stanley Bailey frog. And then I've got a bedrock frog here. You can see much more contact with the sole, much more sturdy bedding for the plane as well. Let's talk a little bit about chip breakers. They're a little bit of a misnomer when you say chip breaker. They don't really break the chip very much. They might give a little bit of extra oomph to break it. But by the time that chip has seen the leading edge of the plane iron, it's bent. What is important though is that the two of these, cap iron or chip breaker and plane iron, engage very, very firmly to one another. In an era when steel was very valuable, the irons got to be quite thin, and the chip breaker makes this effectively like a much thicker iron, gives it the stability of a much thicker iron. So I want to bed these together so that there's no light between them whatsoever when I grab them and pinch them together, as if they're in the working position. In order to do that, the easiest way to do that is to lap the bottom or the leading edge of the chip breaker. Cap iron, chip breaker, the same thing. I'm going to use a diamond stone and just do a small amount of honing of it. Hold it flat on the stone, lap it, and occasionally roll it over. Because I want this area all polished and smooth, much like a chisel edge here, not quite as sharp as a chisel because it's soft steel, but I want those shavings to go right by the chip breaker, no problem, no rust or any sort of burrs to prevent that from happening. And then the ultimate test is to check it against the iron. Now the iron's got a flat back, we already have done that. So when we hold these together, pinch them lightly, I want to see no light between them. Any light between them is a gap that a shaving can lodge itself between and clog up the plane, or the two of them are not bedded well with each other, the plane iron can shatter. Where do you set the chip breaker in relationship to the edge of the iron? Well, it doesn't need to be super close. A 1/16 of an inch is probably a good position for it. If you want to get it closer than that, that's up to you.